The village of Little Winthorpe lay nestled among gently rolling hills, its thatched cottages and rose-laden fences glowing warmly beneath the soft light of a June afternoon. The scent of freshly cut grass mingled with lavender drifting from cottage gardens, and the distant chiming of church bells lent the air an almost storybook serenity. It was, as many agreed, the perfect setting for a wedding. Miss Jane Marple, seated comfortably in a wicker chair in the garden of her dear friend Mrs. Bantry, observed the scene with mild approval. Her knitting needles clicked softly, though her eyes, sharp and quietly perceptive, were not truly on her work. "They do say," remarked Mrs. Bantry, pouring tea with a decisive hand, "that no village wedding has caused quite so much excitement in recent years." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Excitement is often a curious thing, dear Dolly. It may begin as something quite charming, and yet, in my experience, it rarely remains so." Mrs. Bantry paused mid-pour. "Oh, Jane, don't be ominous. This is to be a perfectly happy occasion. Young love, a splendid estate, and a bride who is, by all accounts, quite lovely." "Yes," said Miss Marple gently. "One always hopes so." The bride and groom, the bride, Miss Eleanor Ashcombe, had only recently arrived in Little Winthorpe, inheriting Ashcombe Manor after the unexpected passing of her great-aunt. Though not born to the village, she had quickly become its focal point, young, elegant, and possessed of a quiet grace that drew admiration from nearly everyone she met. There was, however, something about her that intrigued Miss Marple. "She smiles very sweetly," Miss Marple had once remarked, "but one does occasionally wonder what lies behind it." The groom, Mr. Philip Harcourt, was of an entirely different nature. A London solicitor with an air of easy confidence, he had charmed the village almost immediately upon his arrival. Handsome, articulate, and attentive, he seemed devoted to Eleanor in every respect. A most agreeable young man, Mrs. Bantry had declared. "Indeed," Miss Marple had replied, though her tone had held a note of quiet reservation. Ashcombe Manor itself, stood at the edge of the village, a grand but slightly austere house of grey stone, surrounded by ancient oaks and sweeping lawns. Its long windows reflected the changing skies, and its corridors, some whispered, held the weight of old family secrets. Preparations for the wedding were in full swing. Servants hurried about with flowers, ribbons, and silver trays. The great hall had been transformed into a scene of festivity, with garlands of white roses draped across the banisters and tables set with polished crystal. Among those present at the manor were several figures whose presence would, in time, prove far from incidental. The guests first, there was Mr. Lionel Ashcombe, a distant cousin of Eleanor's, and, until recently, the presumed heir to the estate. His disappointment at Eleanor's inheritance was not entirely concealed beneath his polished manners. "A stroke of misfortune," he had once said lightly, though his eyes had not matched his tone. Then there was Miss Clara Whitby, Eleanor's childhood friend, who had arrived from Bath to serve as bridesmaid. Clara was vivacious, talkative, and seemingly devoted, but there was, perhaps, a certain intensity in her attentions that did not escape Miss Marple's notice. Dr. Edward Langley, the village physician, was also frequently in attendance. A reserved man with a thoughtful demeanour, he had known Eleanor's great-aunt well, and had taken a keen interest in Eleanor's well-being since her arrival. Finally, there was Mrs. Agatha Price, the housekeeper, a formidable woman, whose loyalty to the Ashcombe family was unquestionable, though her sharp eyes missed very little. An uneasy observation: Miss Marple's invitation to the wedding had come somewhat unexpectedly, though she suspected Mrs. Bantry's influence in the matter. On the afternoon prior to the ceremony, she took a quiet walk through the gardens of Ashcombe Manor. It was there that she observed something that gave her pause. Near the rose arbor, partially concealed by foliage, Eleanor stood speaking with Mr. Lionel Ashcombe. Their conversation was low, but the tension between them was unmistakable. "You cannot expect me to simply accept this," Lionel was saying. Eleanor's voice, though soft, carried a firmness that surprised Miss Marple. "I expect you to behave with decency, Lionel, nothing more. There are matters you do not fully understand," he replied, his tone edged with something darker. Eleanor's expression did not waver. "On the contrary," she said, "I understand very well." Miss Marple moved away quietly, her mind already turning. "Family disputes," she murmured to herself, "are seldom as straightforward as they appear." The eve of the wedding that evening, a small gathering was held at the manor, a dinner for close friends and family. The atmosphere, though outwardly cheerful, held an undercurrent of unease. Clara Whitby laughed a little too brightly. Dr. Langley seemed distracted. Lionel Ashcombe drank rather more wine than was strictly advisable. And Eleanor herself, though gracious and composed, appeared at moments to withdraw into a private world of thought. Miss Marple, seated beside Mrs. Price, engaged the housekeeper in polite conversation. "A great deal of effort has gone into the preparations," Miss Marple remarked. Mrs. Price inclined her head. Miss Eleanor wished everything to be perfect. "A natural desire," said Miss Marple, "though perfection, I find, can be rather demanding." Mrs. Price's lips tightened slightly. "The Ashcombe family has always maintained certain standards." Indeed, Miss Marple said gently. A private conversation later that evening. Miss Marple found herself alone in the drawing-room when Eleanor entered. "Miss Marple," she said, with a faint smile, "I hope you are comfortable." "Very much so, my dear," Miss Marple replied. "You have arranged everything beautifully." Eleanor hesitated, then took a seat opposite her. "Do you ever feel," she asked quietly, "that one's life may change entirely in a single moment?" Miss Marple regarded her thoughtfully. "Yes," she said, "though it is often not the moment itself, but what leads up to it, that proves most significant." Eleanor's gaze dropped. "I wonder if I have done the right thing." "That," said Miss Marple kindly, "is a question many brides have asked themselves on the eve of their wedding." Eleanor smiled faintly, though it did not reach her eyes. "I suppose so." The morning of the wedding, the day dawned bright and clear. The village church, St. Bartholomew's, was adorned with white lilies and ribbons. Villagers gathered in their finest attire, exchanging whispers and speculation. Miss Marple arrived early, taking her seat with a quiet air of observation. The guests assembled. Clara Whitby fluttered about nervously. Lionel Ashcombe stood near the entrance, his expression unreadable. Dr. Langley spoke in hushed tones with the vicar. At last, the bride arrived. Eleanor Ashcombe entered the church in a gown of ivory silk, her veil catching the morning light. For a moment, all seemed perfectly as it should be. The ceremony began. The inciting incident: it was during the exchange of vows that the first sign of trouble appeared. Philip Harcourt faltered, only slightly but enough for Miss Marple to notice. A hand to his temple, a flicker of confusion in his eyes. "Are you unwell?" Eleanor whispered. "Just a moment," he replied. But the moment passed, something was clearly amiss. Philip swayed. There was a murmur among the guests, and then, quite suddenly, he collapsed. Chaos followed. The vicar called for assistance. Dr. Langley rushed forward. Clara gasped, clutching at Eleanor, who stood frozen in place. Miss Marple remained seated, her eyes keen and steady. "Most unfortunate," she murmured softly. A grim discovery: Philip Harcourt was carried to a side room. Minutes passed. The murmurs grew louder. At last, Dr. Langley emerged, his face grave. "I regret to say," he announced, "that Mr. Harcourt is dead." A stunned silence fell over the church. Eleanor did not cry out. She simply stood, her expression pale and distant, as though the world had shifted beneath her feet. Miss Marple rose slowly. "Such a terrible occurrence," Mrs. Bantry whispered. "Yes," said Miss Marple quietly. "Terrible indeed." She paused, her gaze moving thoughtfully across the assembled faces: the anxious, the shocked, the calculating. "And yet," she added, almost to herself, "one cannot help but feel that this was no ordinary tragedy." Miss Marple's first suspicion later, as the guests dispersed in confusion and sorrow, Miss Marple lingered near the doorway of the church. Dr. Langley spoke in hushed tones with a constable who had been summoned. "Heart failure, perhaps," the constable suggested. Dr. Langley hesitated. "I should prefer not to speculate," he said. Miss Marple stepped forward. "My dear doctor," she said gently, "forgive me, but I wonder if Mr. Harcourt had taken anything prior to the ceremony. A tonic, perhaps, or a drink." Dr. Langley looked at her sharply. "Why do you ask, Miss Marple?" She folded her hands neatly. "Oh, nothing in particular," she said, "only that sudden collapses are so very rarely without cause." Her eyes, calm and perceptive, held his for a moment. "And causes," she added softly, "are so often quite human." The death of Philip Harcourt cast a long and immediate shadow over Little Winthorpe. What had begun as a day of celebration dissolved into quiet dread. The villagers spoke in hushed tones, doors closed earlier than usual that evening, and even the birds seemed, in Miss Marple's private estimation, to sing a little less brightly. At Ashcombe Manor, the atmosphere was altogether altered. The white ribbons and flowers remained, but their cheerfulness had taken on a grotesque quality, as though the house itself had not yet grasped that its purpose had shifted from wedding to mourning. Miss Marple, having accepted Mrs. Bantry's firm insistence that she remain involved, arrived at the manor the following morning. "I simply cannot sit at home and speculate," Mrs. Bantry had declared. If something dreadful has happened, and it clearly has, then one must know the truth of it. Miss Marple, who entirely agreed, had said nothing. The official word Inspector Caldwell, a practical and methodical man from the county police, had taken charge of the matter. Miss Marple observed him from a distance at first. He moved with quiet efficiency, speaking to servants, examining the dining room, and making careful notes. His manner was polite but firm, a man accustomed to separating fact from emotion. A sensible sort of fellow, Mrs. Bantry whispered approvingly. Yes, said Miss Marple. Though one sometimes finds that facts, like people, do not always present themselves in their most truthful form at first glance. Cause for suspicion. It was soon established that Philip Harcourt had shown no sign of illness prior to the ceremony. He had breakfasted lightly, spoken cheerfully with guests, and had even been seen laughing with Clara Whitby in the garden scarcely an hour before the wedding. Yet within moments of taking his vows, he had collapsed and died. Dr. Langley, when pressed by Inspector Caldwell, admitted that the symptoms were unusual. There was no prolonged distress, he explained. No indication of heart failure in the traditional sense. The inspector's gaze sharpened. Poison? Dr. Langley hesitated. It is a possibility. The word spread quickly. Poison. In a village like Little Winthorpe, the idea was both shocking and strangely compelling. Miss Marple, however, merely folded her hands and considered. Poisoning, she murmured to Mrs. Bantry later, is so often a matter of opportunity and temperament. It requires patience and a certain kind of mind. And do we have such a mind among us? Mrs. Bantry asked. My dear, said Miss Marple gently, one almost always does. Miss Marple observes, Miss Marple observes. Miss Marple began, as was her custom, not with direct accusations, but with observation. She seated herself in the drawing room, where visitors came and went, and listened. It was remarkable, she often reflected, how much people revealed when they believed themselves unobserved. Eleanor Ashcombe, the bride herself, was, perhaps, the most puzzling of all. Eleanor received visitors with quiet composure, though her pale face and subdued manner spoke of deep shock. I cannot understand it, she said to Miss Marple when they were briefly alone. He was perfectly well. There was nothing at all to suggest. Her voice faltered. Miss Marple regarded her kindly. You must not distress yourself unnecessarily, my dear. Such matters are best approached with calm reflection. Eleanor clasped her hands tightly. Do you think someone could have wished him harm? Miss Marple did not answer at once. It is sometimes the case, she said at last, that harm intended for one person finds its way to another. Eleanor looked at her sharply. What do you mean? Miss Marple smiled faintly. Only that one must consider all possibilities. Mr. Lionel Ashcombe proved rather less composed. Miss Marple encountered him in the garden, where he stood smoking with visible agitation. A damned tragedy, he said abruptly. Utterly senseless. Indeed, Miss Marple agreed. He glanced at her. You're Miss Marple, I believe? A friend of Mrs. Bantry's. I have that pleasure. Lionel exhaled sharply. Well, I suppose everyone will be looking for someone to blame. That's the way of things. It is often the way, Miss Marple said mildly, though blame is not always so easily assigned. He studied her for a moment. You don't think I had anything to do with it, I hope? Miss Marple met his gaze calmly. I do not think anything at all, Mr. Ashcombe, until I have observed a little more. He gave a short laugh, though it lacked humour. Very wise, yet his unease was unmistakable. Miss Clara Whitby was found in the morning room, her eyes red from weeping. Oh, Miss Marple, she cried, it's simply dreadful. Poor Philip and Eleanor, oh, I cannot bear it. Miss Marple sat beside her. You were very fond of Mr. Harcourt. Clara hesitated just briefly. He was delightful, she said. Such charm, such kindness. Eleanor was terribly lucky. Indeed, Miss Marple murmured. Clara twisted her handkerchief. And now this. It's like something out of a horrid novel. Miss Marple's gaze rested on her thoughtfully. Yes, she said. Though novels, my dear, are often closer to reality than we care to admit. Dr. Langley, the doctor, proved more difficult to read. Miss Marple found him in his study, examining a small vial. You are very thorough, doctor, she remarked. He looked up. One must be. You suspect poison, then? I suspect, he said carefully, that Mr. Harcourt did not die a natural death. Miss Marple nodded. And the means? That is what I intend to discover. She inclined her head. You knew Miss Ashcombe's great-aunt, I believe. Yes, he said shortly. A strong woman, I understand. Very. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Such women often leave complicated legacies. Dr. Langley's expression darkened slightly. What are you suggesting? Nothing at all, Miss Marple replied gently, but her eyes were thoughtful. Mrs. Price, the housekeeper, Mrs. Price, remained as formidable as ever. No one entered the kitchen without my knowledge, she stated firmly when questioned. And the refreshments served before the ceremony? Miss Marple inquired. Prepared under my supervision. No irregularities, none whatsoever. Miss Marple considered this. Then it seems, she said softly, that whatever was administered must have been done elsewhere. Mrs. Price's lips tightened. If you imply negligence, I imply nothing, Miss Marple said pleasantly. Only that facts have a way of arranging themselves given time. A curious detail: it was Mrs. Bantry who first mentioned the matter of the champagne. There was a glass, she said, lowering her voice. Philip had a glass of champagne just before the ceremony. I remember because Clara insisted he must have it for luck. Miss Marple's knitting paused. Clara insisted. Yes, quite playfully, of course. But still, Miss Marple's eyes sharpened slightly. Was anyone else drinking from the same bottle? I believe so, though I couldn't say who, exactly. Miss Marple nodded. A small detail, she said. But such things are often of interest. Rising tensions as the day wore on. Tensions within the manor grew increasingly apparent. Lionel argued sharply with Mrs. Price over access to certain rooms. Clara remained in a state of nervous agitation. Eleanor withdrew almost entirely, receiving only the most necessary visitors, and Dr. Langley spent long hours in quiet examination. Miss Marple, moving gently among them, gathered impressions like threads, each slight, perhaps insignificant on its own, but together forming something far more substantial. Miss Marple reflected that evening. Miss Marple sat once more with Mrs. Bantry. Well? Mrs. Bantry asked eagerly. What do you make of it all? Miss Marple folded her hands. There is, she said slowly, a great deal of emotion in that house. Resentment, admiration, fear, and something else. What else? Expectation. Mrs. Bantry frowned. Expectation of what? Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the window. Of change, she said softly. Of gain or loss. She paused. And then there is the matter of the champagne. Yes? It suggests something quite deliberate. Mrs. Bantry leaned forward. You mean? Miss Marple nodded slightly. I mean, she said, that someone present at that wedding intended for something to happen. The stakes are raised late that night. A new development shook the household. Inspector Caldwell requested that all members of the party remain at Ashcombe Manor until further notice. No one is to leave, he stated firmly. A formal investigation is now underway. The word murder was not spoken aloud, but it hung in the air all the same. Miss Marple, retiring to her room, sat for some time in quiet thought. Poison, she murmured, champagne, and a bride who wonders if she has done the right thing. Her knitting lay forgotten in her lap. Such things, she said softly, are never without meaning. The second day after the tragic wedding dawned beneath a sky of uncertain grey, as though even the heavens hesitated to commit to clarity. Within Ashcombe Manor, the tension had sharpened into something almost tangible. Inspector Caldwell's quiet authority ensured order, but not calm. Servants whispered in corners. Doors closed more quickly than usual. Conversations halted the moment another entered the room. Miss Marple, moving gently through the house, found the atmosphere most instructive. People under strain, she reflected to herself, often reveal far more than they intend. The champagne glass, the first significant development, came shortly after breakfast. Inspector Caldwell summoned the principal members of the household to the drawing room. I have received a preliminary report, he announced. The champagne glass used by Mr. Harcourt has been examined. A silence fell. And? Lionel Ashcombe demanded. There were traces, the inspector continued, of a fast-acting poison. A collective intake of breath. Clara Whitby let out a small cry. Eleanor sat very still, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Poison? Mrs. Price said sharply. In this house. Inspector Caldwell's gaze swept the room. It would appear so. Miss Marple, seated quietly near the window, lowered her eyes. So, she murmured. We are no longer dealing with possibility, but certainty. A question of opportunity, the inspector continued. The champagne was served shortly before the ceremony. Several glasses were poured, but only one appears to have been contaminated. Then it was meant for Philip, Clara said quickly. Perhaps, said the inspector. Or perhaps not. Miss Marple looked up. Indeed, she said softly. Such things are not always as precise as one might suppose. Inspector Caldwell regarded her thoughtfully. Do you suggest the victim may not have been the intended target? Miss Marple smiled faintly. I suggest nothing, only that one must consider the possibility. A hidden letter. The next twist came from an unexpected source. One of the maids, in the course of tidying Eleanor's dressing room, discovered a letter hidden within a jewelry box. It was addressed to Philip Harcourt. Inspector Caldwell read it aloud. You must not go through with this marriage. You do not know what you are doing. If you persist, the consequences will be more severe than you can imagine. The letter was unsigned. A murmur swept the room. Well? Lionel exclaimed. That seems rather conclusive. Someone wished to prevent the marriage. Clara looked pale. But who? All eyes turned, almost instinctively, toward Eleanor. Her face flushed. I have never seen that letter before, yet it was found among your things, the inspector pointed out. I cannot explain it, she said firmly. Miss Marple watched her closely. Truth, she reflected, has a curious way of revealing itself not only in words, but in their absence. Suspicion falls. The discovery of the letter shifted the balance of suspicion dramatically. Lionel Ashcombe was quick to capitalize upon it. It seems perfectly clear, he said. Philip had enemies, or at the very least, someone who disapproved strongly of the marriage. Disapproval, Miss Marple observed gently, is not uncommon in such matters. Yes, but threats are, Lionel retorted. Clara, meanwhile, appeared deeply unsettled. I cannot believe anyone would do such a thing, she said. It's monstrous. Monstrous, perhaps, Miss Marple agreed, but not unprecedented. Dr. Langley remained silent, his expression unreadable. A private revelation. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple found Eleanor alone in the garden. My dear, she said kindly, you must not allow yourself to be overwhelmed. Eleanor turned to her, her composure faltering for the first time. They think I had something to do with it, she said. I can see it in their faces. Miss Marple did not contradict her. Did you? She asked gently. Eleanor stared at her in shock. Of course not. Miss Marple nodded. I believed you would say so. Eleanor hesitated, then spoke in a low voice. There is something I have not told anyone. Miss Marple's eyes softened. You may tell me if you wish. Eleanor drew a breath. Philip was not what he seemed. Philip's secret, according to Eleanor. Philip Harcourt had revealed, shortly before the wedding, that he was in considerable financial difficulty. He had debts, she said. Serious ones. Miss Marple nodded slightly. And yet he intended to marry you. Yes, and you are, I believe, in possession of a rather substantial inheritance. Eleanor looked away. Yes. Miss Marple's expression remained thoughtful. A motive then, she murmured, though not perhaps the one most immediately apparent. Another layer. The situation grew more complex still when Dr. Langley approached Inspector Caldwell with further information. I have examined the poison more closely, he said. It is not a common substance. In fact, it would be difficult to obtain without some knowledge of chemistry. The inspector frowned. And who among us possesses such knowledge? Dr. Langley hesitated. I do. The room fell silent. And, he added quietly, so did Miss Ashcombe's great-aunt. Miss Marple's eyes flickered. Oh, she said softly. A legacy indeed. A red herring emerges that evening. Another startling discovery was made. In Lionel Ashcombe's room, a small vial was found containing traces of the same poison. The reaction was immediate. This is absurd, Lionel protested. I've never seen that before in my life, and yet it was in your possession, the inspector pointed out. I tell you, it's not mine. Clara looked at him with wide, frightened eyes. Mrs. Price regarded him with open suspicion. Miss Marple, however, remained serene. How very unfortunate, she said. Lionel turned on her. You don't believe this nonsense, do you? Miss Marple met his gaze calmly. I believe, she said, that things are not always where they appear to be, nor do they always belong to those who seem to possess them. Rising stakes with the discovery of the vial, the investigation took a sharper turn. Lionel Ashcombe became the primary suspect. His prior dispute with Eleanor, his potential loss of inheritance, and now the apparent possession of poison all combined to form a compelling case. Inspector Caldwell ordered him to remain under close observation. You must understand, he said, that the evidence is difficult to ignore. Lionel's face darkened. This is a setup. Someone is trying to frame me. Miss Marple, listening quietly, tilted her head slightly. A possibility, she murmured. Miss Marple connects threads that night. Miss Marple sat alone in her room, her knitting once again untouched. Poison in the champagne, she said softly. A threatening letter. A vial in the wrong room, and a bride with doubts. She closed her eyes briefly. Too many threads, she murmured. And yet, they do not weave together as they should. She thought of Clara's insistence on the champagne, of Eleanor's hesitation, of Dr. Langley's knowledge, and of Lionel's anger so very open, so very obvious. Miss Marple smiled faintly. My dear nephew Raymond always says, she reflected, that things are seldom as simple as they appear in books. And yet, I have found quite the opposite, that real life is often far more structured, if one only knows how to read it. Subtle clue. As she prepared for bed, a small detail returned to her mind. Mrs. Bantry's words. Clara insisted he must have it for luck. Miss Marple's eyes opened. Luck, she repeated softly. She sat very still. And yet, luck is such a curious thing. A quiet realization begins. The pieces were not yet complete, but something had shifted. Miss Marple rose and moved to the window, looking out over the darkened grounds of Ashcombe Manor. Someone, she said quietly, planned this very carefully. Her gaze grew thoughtful, but not carefully enough. The following morning dawned with a deceptive calm. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows of Ashcombe Manor, illuminating polished surfaces and wilted wedding flowers alike. The house, though outwardly tranquil, held within it a quiet anticipation, as though something long suspended was at last nearing resolution. Miss Marple, who had slept very little, sat at her writing desk with a cup of tea growing cold beside her. Details, she murmured softly. It is always the details. Her mind, precise and orderly, moved through each element of the Casanova as isolated incidents, but as parts of a carefully arranged whole. The poisoned champagne, the anonymous letter, Lionel's conveniently discovered vial, Clara's insistence, Eleanor's doubt, Dr. Langley's knowledge. She smiled faintly. Yes, she said, it is all quite clear now. A request for gathering shortly after breakfast. Miss Marple sought out Inspector Caldwell. I wonder, she said gently, if you might indulge an old woman in a small request. The inspector, who had come to regard Miss Marple with a mixture of curiosity and respect, inclined his head. That depends on the nature of the request. I should like everyone to be gathered in the drawing-room, she said. There are one or two observations I believe may be of assistance. Inspector Caldwell studied her for a moment. You believe you know what happened? Miss Marple smiled. I believe, she said, that I understand it sufficiently to be of use. After a brief pause, the inspector nodded. Very well. The gathering. The principal members of the household assembled once more. Eleanor Ashcombe sat pale but composed. Clara Whitby appeared anxious, her fingers twisting her handkerchief. Lionel Ashcombe stood with arms folded, his expression defensive. Dr. Langley remained quietly observant. Mrs. Price stood near the door, as rigid as ever. Inspector Caldwell addressed them briefly. Miss Marple has requested this meeting. I suggest we hear what she has to say. All eyes turned to the elderly lady, who rose with gentle composure. Miss Marple begins. My dear friends, she said, this has been a most distressing occurrence. A wedding, which ought to have brought joy, has instead brought tragedy. She paused. Such things, however, do not happen without reason. Her gaze moved lightly across the room. We have before us several curious elements. A poisoned glass of champagne, a letter of warning, a vial found in a gentleman's room, and a number of individuals, each with motives of varying strength. Lionel shifted impatiently. If you have something to say, Miss Marple, I wish you would say it plainly. Miss Marple smiled. Of course. The first truth, the target to begin with, she said. We must consider whether Mr. Harcourt was indeed the intended victim. A murmur rose. Surely that's obvious, Clara said quickly. Is it? Miss Marple replied gently. The champagne was poured for several people. It was only by chance, or perhaps by suggestion, that Mr. Harcourt drank from that particular glass. She turned slightly. Miss Whitby, I believe you encouraged him to do so. Clara flushed. It was only a joke, just a bit of fun. Quite so, Miss Marple said. And yet, how very fortunate that it was he and not another who drank from it. Clara's lips trembled. What are you implying? Only, said Miss Marple softly, that the intended victim may not have been Mr. Harcourt at all. All eyes turned, slowly, toward Eleanor. The second truth, the motive. Miss Ashcombe, Miss Marple continued gently. You were in possession of a considerable inheritance. Eleanor nodded faintly. And you had, perhaps, begun to question your impending marriage. Eleanor's hands tightened. Yes. Miss Marple inclined her head. It is not uncommon, you know, for young ladies to find themselves uncertain at such a moment. She paused. And it is also not uncommon for others to have strong feelings on the matter. Her gaze shifted. Miss Whitby, you were most devoted to your friend, were you not? Of course I was. And yet, Miss Marple said, you were also very fond of Mr. Harcourt. Clara went very still. What are you saying? Miss Marple's voice remained calm. I am saying, my dear, that affection, particularly when unreturned, can lead to the most unfortunate decisions. The third truth, the letter. She lifted a small paper from the table. The anonymous letter, she said. A warning to Mr. Harcourt not to proceed with the marriage. She looked up. It was not, I think, written by Miss Ashcombe, nor by Mr. Ashcombe, nor by Dr. Langley. Her eyes rested on Clara. It was written by someone who wished to prevent the marriage, but not necessarily to save Mr. Harcourt. Clara shook her head. No, that's not true. It is quite understandable, Miss Marple said gently. You wish to frighten him, to make him reconsider. But when that failed, Clara's breath came quickly. The fourth truth, the poison itself, Miss Marple continued, was not easily obtained. It required knowledge and access. She turned to Dr. Langley. You possess such knowledge, doctor, but you had no reason to act. Dr. Langley inclined his head. That is correct. Miss Marple nodded. However, Miss Whitby had been staying in the house. She had access to Miss Ashcombe's late aunt's belongings, including certain substances kept for medicinal or perhaps experimental purposes. Mrs. Price stiffened. Those were locked away locks, Miss Marple said gently, are not always as secure as one might hope. The fifth truth, the vial. And finally, she said, we come to the matter of the vial found in Mr. Ashcombe's room. Lionel straightened. Yes, perhaps you can explain that. Miss Marple smiled faintly. It was placed there, she said, to divert suspicion. Lionel let out a breath. And who would do such a thing? Miss Marple turned. Someone who wished to ensure that blame fell elsewhere. Her gaze rested once more on Clara. The culprit revealed the room was utterly silent. Clara Whitby stood as though rooted to the spot, her face pale, her eyes wide. No, she whispered. No, you're wrong. Miss Marple's voice was very gentle. You loved him, she said, and you could not bear to see him marry, particularly when that marriage would secure his future. Tears filled Clara's eyes. I only wanted him to see sense, she said. To realize that he did not love you, Miss Marple said softly. Clara's composure broke. I couldn't let it happen, she cried. He was making a mistake. He was marrying her for money. He didn't deserve her, and so, Miss Marple said. You decided that if the marriage could not be prevented, Miss Ashcombe herself must be removed. A gasp echoed through the room. Eleanor stared in horror. You tried to kill me? Clara covered her face. I didn't mean, she sobbed. I didn't think you poisoned the champagne, Miss Marple said quietly, intending it for Miss Ashcombe. But by urging Mr. Harcourt to drink first, you sealed his fate instead. Clara sank into a chair, trembling. It was an accident, she whispered. It wasn't meant for him. Final confirmation. Inspector Caldwell stepped forward. Miss Whitby, he said, I must ask you to come with me. She did not resist. As she was led from the room, her sobs echoing faintly down the corridor, a heavy silence remained behind. Miss Marple reflects. Miss Marple resumed her seat. So often, she said quietly, it is not hatred, but misguided affection, that leads to such tragedies. Eleanor sat motionless, her face pale. I trusted her, she said. Yes, Miss Marple replied gently. And that, I think, is the saddest part of all. In the days that followed Clara Whitby's arrest, a profound stillness settled over Ashcombe Manor. The bright decorations were quietly removed. The white roses, once symbols of celebration, were gathered and discarded. Even the sunlight, which had seemed so golden on the morning of the wedding, now appeared subdued, as though the house itself had drawn inward, reflecting upon what had transpired within its walls. Little Winthorpe, too, absorbed the shock in its own way. There was no shortage of discussion, of course. The villagers spoke in low voices over garden fences, and in the corner of the tea shop. Yet beneath the curiosity lay something deeper, a shared unease that such darkness could have touched their quiet, orderly world. Miss Marple, seated once again in Mrs. Bantry's garden, resumed her knitting. It is always the same, she remarked gently. People are surprised when wickedness appears close to home, and yet, one finds it everywhere, only in different guises. Mrs. Bantry shuddered. I shall never look at weddings in quite the same way again. Miss Marple smiled faintly. My dear Dolly, weddings are no more dangerous than any other gathering of human beings. It is only that they bring together so many expectations, as I have often observed, can be very troublesome things. Inspector Caldwell's conclusion, the official findings, once completed, confirmed Miss Marple's deductions in every detail. Clara Whitby had indeed obtained the poison from a locked cabinet belonging to Eleanor's late great-aunt. Though not formally trained, she had possessed just enough knowledge and just enough determination to use it. Her intention, as she tearfully confessed, had been to poison Eleanor Ashcombe before the marriage could take place. She would have been free of him, Clara had said, and he would have been free to see reason. But her plan had faltered at the final moment. By urging Philip to drink first under the guise of a playful wedding tradition, she had unwittingly caused his death instead. The letter, too, had been her doing, a desperate attempt to frighten Philip into abandoning the marriage. And the vial in Mr. Ashcombe's room? Mrs. Bantry asked eagerly. Placed there by Miss Whitby, Miss Marple replied. A simple, if rather clumsy, attempt to divert suspicion. Mrs. Bantry shook her head. Extraordinary. And to think she seemed such a sweet girl. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. Yes, she said. Sweetness, like many things, can be quite deceptive. Lionel Ashcombe's position. Lionel Ashcombe, though cleared of all suspicion, did not emerge from the affair entirely unscathed. It's an infernal business, he said to Miss Marple during a chance encounter in the garden. To be accused, however, briefly of such a thing. Quite so, Miss Marple agreed. He hesitated, then added, I suppose I did not help matters. My disagreement with Eleanor, it must have looked rather bad. Appearances, Miss Marple said gently, often misleading. Lionel gave a short laugh. You may say so. I had thought myself the unluckiest man in England, but I begin to think I was, in fact, rather fortunate. Miss Marple regarded him thoughtfully. Yes, she said, fortune, like misfortune, has a curious way of revealing itself over time. Dr. Langley's quiet reflection. Dr. Langley, for his part, returned to his duties with a renewed gravity. I have seen many deaths, he said to Miss Marple one afternoon, but this was something different, because it need not have happened, Miss Marple suggested. Yes, he paused. I cannot help but feel that I might have prevented it had I been more attentive. Miss Marple shook her head gently. My dear doctor, one cannot guard against every folly of the human heart. Nor should one attempt to do so. Dr. Langley inclined his head. You are very wise, Miss Marple. She smiled faintly. I have simply lived a very long time. Eleanor Ashcombe's future of all those affected. It was Eleanor who bore the greatest weight. For several days she remained in seclusion, receiving no visitors. At last, however, she sent for Miss Marple. I wish to thank you, she said quietly, as they sat together in the drawing-room. You have given me back my life. Miss Marple regarded her kindly. My dear, it is you who must decide what to do with it. Eleanor's gaze drifted to the window. I thought I understood everything, she said. I believed I was acting sensibly, making a prudent match. And yet, Miss Marple said gently, one's heart is not always so easily persuaded. Eleanor nodded. I shall not make that mistake again. Miss Marple smiled. One hopes, she said, that we all learn from our mistakes, though in my experience, we often require several attempts. Eleanor managed a faint smile. The village restores itself gradually. Life in Little Winthorpe returned to its accustomed rhythms. The church bells rang once more for ordinary services. The gardens bloomed as they always had. Conversations turned, slowly but surely, to less troubling matters. And yet, the memory of the wedding lingered. It became, in time, one of those stories that villagers told in lowered voices, a cautionary tale, perhaps. Or simply a reminder that even the most idyllic settings are not immune to human folly. Miss Marple's final reflection one evening, as the sun dipped low over the hills, Miss Marple sat quietly with Mrs. Bantry. It is all so sad, Mrs. Bantry said. Such a dreadful waste. Yes, Miss Marple agreed. She set aside her knitting and folded her hands. You know, my dear, people often speak of love as though it were an entirely noble thing. Mrs. Bantry looked at her curiously. Is it not? Miss Marple considered. It can be, she said, but it can also be selfish, possessive, even destructive. She paused. Miss Whitby loved Mr. Harcourt in her own way, but it was not a love that sought his happiness only her own. Mrs. Bantry sighed. And so it ended in tragedy. Yes. Miss Marple's gaze rested on the fading light. But there is, I think, a small comfort to be found. What is that? That truth, in the end, has a way of coming to light. And when it does, it allows those who remain to begin again. A return to quiet as dusk settled over Little Winthorpe. The world seemed once more at peace. Miss Marple picked up her knitting, her needles moving with steady precision. To begin again, she murmured softly, and in the quiet rhythm of her work, there was something enduring, something that spoke not only of endings, but of continuance.